the Russians are in a pretty bad situation in terms of training their personnel, so they can get people, they can give them a weapon system, helmet, etc. But they can't cohere that into combined arms manoeuvre and take back a lot of territory. They can still take territory, but it's these brutal attacks where they, over the last 6 weeks, they've been losing killed or wounded around 1,200 per day. That's a battalion a day, and they're still on the offensive. So it kind of shows how challenging this situation is. It all rests on effectively ammunition supply. And the training burden, though challenging on the Ukrainian side, it's a bit better because we have NATO trainers and a variety of guises and EU trainers as well, sort of providing that. But I think that's the real issue now. It's not necessarily numbers, it's about the quality of troops.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Gerbeau. And today we are joined from Washington by Ed Arnold, a European Security Research Fellow at the think tank RUSI. His main focus being the transformation of that security following Russia's war in Ukraine. As an infantry officer in the British Army, he was deployed to Afghanistan and East Africa and was posted at the Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe in 2014. Ed Arnold, great to see you again. Thank you so much for making time for us. As I said, you joined us from Washington just hours before the end of NATO's 75th anniversary summit. Can you just put this into context for us? Because it is a critical time for European and global security. What was the mood like and what struck you?
I think the mood was broadly positive because this summit is double hatting also as the 75th anniversary. There has been a lot of sort of, historical analysis looking back to the foundations and also NATO's successes over the last 75 years. Probably more of a focus on that than the future. And it's really been incremental progress this time round for this summit, which is incrementally improved, NATO's continuing defence and deterrence transformation, far more on the defence industrial side this time round, so not just in terms of spending, which 23 allies out of the 32 are now meeting the 2%. This is more on putting sustainable, industry on sustainable footing, and then incremental progress again on Ukraine's potential membership. No invitation to join yet. That was expected prior to the summit, but also relatively no new surprises. I'd say the most surprising thing, though, from the declaration yesterday, and we've heard it from a variety of senior US policymakers over the last couple of days, is calling out China as an enabler of Russia's war within Ukraine. That, the language there has been far more focused and ambitious than it has in previous summitry.
Yes, I'm going to ask you a bit more about that a little later on. I just wanted to ask you about the timing of this summit or the timing of the attack on Kiev, this horrific bombing spree by Russia when it hit the children's hospital and the maternity centre there. Has that strengthened the resolve of NATO allies, as the new British Prime Minister had forecast on the way to the summit?
Yeah, I think it has. And I mean, the first thing to say about that strike, that was almost certainly deliberate Russian policy. That was a targeted strike, a horrendous attack, but it was designed to sort of influence the waverers within Europe about support to Ukraine and sort of trying to say to NATO, back off, don't get more involved within this war. I think it's probably had the opposite effect. I think that Ukrainians are always going to get more in terms of air defense because that's a critical requirement. But this is, 5 Patriot systems from the US, which is a significant uplift to what they already have, and another 5 nations getting together and providing more sort of tactical operational air defense below that as well. So that's really important, but it's also important to note this is not about the launchers. It's also about the number of the interceptors, the ammunition, and the requirement for Ukraine. It has to protect its civilian population, it has to protect its critical national infrastructure, and it has to protect its deployed forces in the field across a huge front line. So beneficial for Ukraine, but they could always absorb more.
And the missile that it's reported to have used is the KH-101 cruise missile. If Russia wants to repeat that kind of attack, how many more does it have?
We don't know. Production is ramping up within Russia. We see a lot of when the the missiles hit and the fragmentation, they effectively have a sell-by date on them, which is very, very long. So it shows that these are sort of recently produced missiles. They also have a lot of Western components, which we have trying to shut down back doors to get these components into Russia, but that's always quite difficult. They're able to get things in to reproduce these missiles, and ultimately, as long as they have the missiles, they can do those types of attacks. And while we are providing a lot of air defense systems to Ukraine, like I said, the requirements are vast in Ukraine. So what the Russians are effectively trying to do is saturate Ukrainian air defenses. So firing at civilian targets, firing at critical national infrastructure, firing at deployed forces in the field, to effectively force Ukraine to use up all of its interceptors, to have gaps, to then fire more missiles. This is a war of attrition, and like I say, it's not perfect. I think the Ukrainians are getting very good at taking down as many of these systems as possible, but things are going to get through.
And how have senior officials at the summit been briefing about the war and their assessment of the current situation?
We actually haven't seen too much in terms of detail on the war, in terms of the specific situation on the ground. The situation on the ground is far more concerning than it was at the Vilnius summit last year, when there was very high hopes for the 2023 Ukrainian counteroffensive. They have spoken recently of F-16s, which were previously committed to Ukraine. They've said that they'll be flying over the skies of Ukraine by the summer, which again is a positive. But F-16s on their own are not going to change the dial in terms of what's happening on the ground. I don't think they're going to suddenly mean that the Ukrainians can take over offensive operations. It just means that they'll be able to battle with the Russian Air Force for air parity and sort of protect their forces. But it's not going to make an immediate difference. It will make a difference when other systems such as early warning radars, etc., are also operational within Ukraine.
She's a senior.
And just to say, Ed, the noises we can hear behind you, obviously it's still a lot going on at the summit itself. So just to explain to people that what we hear in the background is obviously going to be quite busy. So thank you for bearing with us on that. A joint declaration from the summit affirmed the alliance's determination to support Ukraine to provide a minimum of 40 billion euros in the next year, sustainable security assistance. Pointedly, as you said earlier, NATO will not be inviting Ukraine to join right now. That's not coming. It did say NATO will never recognise Russia's illegal annexations, including Crimea. So that's quite a bold statement, isn't it? I mean, while Ukraine is waiting for the security that will be provided by becoming a NATO member, what can NATO offer?
Well, actually, I mean, very little, and even the support. So the headline announcement is 40 billion from NATO, but actually that's just wrapping up the aggregation of what is provided bilaterally by NATO members over the last 2 years. And then they're committing to that on a yearly basis. So a lot of what was provided to Ukraine in a new NATO commander, Wiesbaden, Germany, to take over a lot of the training and coordination from the US. They fund the $40 billion dollars. And then also effectively a knowledge exchange centre whereby both NATO and Ukraine can learn how the Russians are fighting, and hopefully trying to turn that into NATO operational doctrine and support the integration. That's all, positive things, but it's effectively what's already happening. So more coordination, more money. Again, it's not really turning the dial on Ukraine. What advocates of Ukrainian membership wanted in the declaration was the word irreversible. So that is sort of the semantic gymnastics moving a little bit further. But actually, we all know that these things are reversible. Famously in 2019 at the NATO North Atlantic Council meeting in London, there was wording that was agreed on China that made it into the declaration. Macron, the following day, basically just said, yes, we don't actually agree with that. And a potential future president, potential President Trump can also renege on that. So
the
kind
irreversible could become reversible, basically, in terms of the
it's anything but irreversible. The one thing that is actually mechanically within the NATO-Washington Treaty that is irreversible is an invitation to join under Article 10 of the treaty. There's nothing within the treaty to say that if an invitation has been made, then so I think there's this bit of a sense here that it was a bit of a wasted opportunity, because also when you go through ratification under Article 11, that's through the national parliaments, and you see all of the political volatility in Europe, especially at the moment. Take the example of France. Getting it through national parliament in France 6 months ago would have been a given. Now it might probably still a given, but a bit more difficult. After the presidential election in 27, would you necessarily get that tick in the box? So we always look at sort of Turkey and Hungary as potentially the difficult sort of partners within the alliance on this. But actually, they're always growing. And I think it's just ultimately going to make things far more difficult in the future when conditions are met, assuming Ukraine wins, however that happens. And then you start the process. That process could still take, a decade or so. So, I think it is a bit of a wasted opportunity that they didn't push forward with an invitation at this summit.
The new British Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, that was his first moment on the world stage. And he met President Zelensky, reported to have told him, which has now been published, that he gave his approval for British supplied Storm Shadow missiles to be fired into Russia. What reaction has there been there to that?
They're broadly positive. And the issue has always been on permissions on the use of various weapon systems by various countries. They've always been sort of pushed into it and reluctant when, it has really hurt Ukraine on the ground. So I think it's pretty striking for one country to be so bold on it, and it'll probably knock a couple of countries to sort of say, okay, that's absolutely fine. And I think linking back to your earlier question about the strike on the hospital on Monday, I mean, it's saying that, well, if those strikes emanate from targetable places within Russia, then that they must be struck. That is the only way of defending. The other potential thing that we haven't heard too much about, and I'm not sure if that's going to be agreed, and it's more of a sort of bilateral issue, but Poland is very keen to be able to use air defence interceptors that are on Polish soil to protect the skies over the western part of Ukraine. That the Poles are very happy to do it, but they want to do it under a NATO framework. So they're sort of pushing forward with that, as we saw in the Middle East when Iran sent a massive wave of drone and missile attacks over towards Israel. I mean, we intercepted them there when there was no broad regional escalation. So people are using that as a sort of an example to say, well, that's just what we're talking about. What's the difference of the Ukrainians using a Polish system within their territory, or the Poles doing it from their own territory?
So if the Poles actually do that, do you think that would be a massive step forward?
I think it would really help, and from a point of view of what that means that that NATO could do, it means it's not gifting necessarily an additional air defence system, which are sort of hard to come by these days because we haven't really ramped up the defence industrial production yet. But it means that they can sort of stay on NATO territory, they can still be assigned to NATO, but they can have an effect with Ukraine. And if the situation allows, because there's an issue in the Baltics or something like that, it can still provide coverage to NATO. So you're effectively being able to affect, the current battle space and a potential future battle space from the same location. So it's actually a pretty tactically to strategically important measure to have.
We've had the Joe Biden announcements of the US and NATO allies making this historic donation of air defence equipment, the dozens of additional tactical air defence systems. He also said, as you mentioned, Denmark and the Netherlands have begun sending F-16s. What about these reports on the sidelines of the summit that Washington and Berlin would start deploying long-range weapons in Germany as a show of commitment to European security?
Yeah, I think that's pretty significant, and it's pretty significant when NATO makes an announcement and the Kremlin get annoyed about it. And effectively, there's a whole host of arms control agreements between Europe, the US, and Russia that effectively were born out of the security situation in the Cold War and post-Cold War to restrict arms control agreements. They have basically just disintegrated over the years, largely through Russian non-compliance. And this means that now the US are saying, well, okay, we're going to start to put these things in. We're going to show what we can do. And sort of, it boosts NATO deterrence in the region because they're able to strike potential locations within Russia pretty easily.
Ahead of this summit, how important do you think the NATO exercise like Steadfast Defender was, the largest of its kind in decades, in sending this message showing not only Russia but European allies that NATO is willing and capable to defend its members?
I think it's very important, but also here we have to be measured in the assessments. I mean, Steadfast Defender was 90,000 troops. It took around 5 years to organise. That's not quick enough. I mean, I know it's an exercise, but that is not quick enough in terms of what the alliance should be able to do at scale. I think there's a lot of exercises going on as well, bilaterally, multilaterally, minilaterally, and then at the NATO level. NATO really needs to move from exercise to rehearsals. The key difference between that is exercising is sort of testing your trade and your ability to do certain things. Rehearsals are effectively when you've had your orders, you are rehearsing for a very specific mission. Now that NATO has these regional plans, I think that everything that they should do should be a rehearsal of national and regional plans. I think, there's too much exercising going on in NATO. Yes, it's quite important from a deterrence perspective, but we really need to sort of stress test these plans in a proper environment using live data on Russian force dispositions, effectively rehearse how we are exactly going to fight, and these regional plans effectively allow that for the first time since the end of the Cold War.
You mentioned earlier about one of the most significant things from the summit is the kind of language that's being used about China. Concerns were raised over its military exercises involving one of its aircraft carriers in the Western Pacific as the summit got underway. And this communique from the summit said China is a decisive enabler of Russia's war effort and a systematic challenge to Euro-Atlantic security. How prepared is Europe to fill any gap that might be left by the US on Ukraine if its major preoccupation does prove to be China?
And I think that's the key point, regardless of who wins the presidential election at the end of the year. The US strategic interests, are continue to gravitate far more towards Asia. So I think under a potential President Trump, the withdrawal disengagement will be harsher, it'll be quicker. It will be communicated probably less well. But even if Biden wins re-election or another Democratic nominee, in fact, then the same thing is going to happen. It just might be more measured. So the Europeans need to be ready for that. The risk is that giving that support to Ukraine is going to be difficult, both in terms of what we can actually provide and also the finances of it. But the real risk is what the US provides to Europe as enablers. It's like the glue that holds the sort of the militaries together in terms of intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, logistics. So if they withdraw, the Europeans, those spending more money on defence, will have to spend it on enablers, not combat power. So actually European combat power might not increase that significantly.
The dependence on US support, though, in Ukraine was evident in the damage, the waiting caused before the $60 billion US aid package was unlocked. Until then, the fear was that the Russian offensive could grind down the Ukrainians or possibly threaten Kharkiv or even ultimately Kiev. Are those threats contained now?
I don't think they're fully contained, but it just showed that when the Ukrainians don't have the tools to do the job, they can't hold the ground. Actual sort of Ukrainian defensive doctrine, also politically, they're willing to hold ground if they can cause disproportionate casualties on the Russians, which they had been doing for a number of years now in particular places like Bakhmut and Avdiivka and other places. When they didn't have the ammunition, they just needed to pull back from those areas, and that what allowed Russia to go on the offensive. Like, it's stabilized now, but it still just shows that if the equipment's not forthcoming, the Ukrainians can't fight as they want. The Russians are in a pretty bad situation in terms of training their personnel, so they can get people, they can give them a weapon system, helmet, etc. But they can't cohere that into combined arms maneuver and take back a lot of territory. They can still take territory, but it's these brutal attacks where they, over the last 6 weeks, they've been losing killed or wounded around 1,200 per day. That's a battalion a day, and they're still on the offensive. So it kind of shows how challenging this situation is. It all rests on effectively ammunition supply. and the training burden, though challenging on the Ukrainian side, it's a bit better because we have NATO trainers and a variety of guises and EU trainers as well, sort of providing that. But I think that's the real issue now. It's not necessarily numbers; it's about the quality of troops.
Let's talk a little bit about the Hungarian leader, Viktor Orban, who now seems to be on this kind of self-declared peace mission, taking in his style, taking in Kiev, Moscow, Beijing. Now he's in Washington. All this since Hungary took over presidency of the EU. How has he been received there? Is there great anxiety over him? Because there's also now speculation that he's actually going to visit Donald Trump.
Yes, I mean, the reports we're hearing here is that he's going down to Mar-a-Lago to visit Trump after immediately going to see Putin. I mean, first things first, this is no sort of peace trip from Orban's side. Just less than a week after shaking Putin's hand, we saw the atrocities that we did in Ukraine on Monday. It puts the alliance in a very difficult position. And actually, I think the alliance, in terms of NATO, but also the EU, realised that they've got a pretty big Hungary problem now on both sides because of the way decision-making works in both of those organisations in terms of unanimity. And it'll be interesting to see what types of punishment that the both organisations are able to provide to Hungary to try and change those behaviours. On the EU side, it's effectively EU central funds, so they would draw the cash to try and push the Hungarian president where they want. NATO can't exactly do that. So it's going to be quite interesting the way that they sort of deal with this in the future. But it is a very difficult position for NATO to be in, and we'll see what happens after the sort of the Trump meeting. But sort of the prevailing view, or the people who've talked to about it here, just seems that he's almost the intermediary now. He's also seen Xi as well, and is he then delivering messages between the two? No one knows at the moment, but it's a pretty big problem for the alliance, I think.
There's bound to have been a lot of nervousness about the forthcoming US election where you are at the summit. Bloomberg is now reporting that President Zelensky wants to hold a second peace summit before then, even with Russia's participation. This is based on undisclosed sources. Have you heard much about that?
No, not directly. And actually, I think although Russia and China was not represented at the Swiss Peace Summit, I mean, there was a view there that Zelensky got quite a lot of traction for his 10-point peace plan. I think the position hasn't really shifted on this for a number of years. I mean, when you look at those 10-point peace plans, I mean, I think there's only probably around 2 or 3 areas where the Russians and the Ukrainians would be able to agree on. A lot of the other ones are pretty much non-starters from both sides. So I think even with a Russian delegation at another peace conference, I don't think you're going to get much further down the line towards 2 positions that either could work for you.
And how much talk was there at the summit about the consequences for the alliance of a return of Trump to the White House?
I don't think much on the consequences. I think there is still a prevailing view that NATO as an organisation, and probably most of the member states, just really don't want it to happen, and probably slightly in denial about it. But you see it with the way that the measures have been announced. I mean, this sort of bridge between Ukrainian membership, based on the new command, the 40 billion, and a couple of other measures. The idea is it's going to try and Trump-proof support to Ukraine from a NATO perspective, so NATO can overtake, and it means that if the US slightly disengages, that NATO can slightly pick up the slack. I mean, in theory that works, but also if that is actually tested, it does mean that NATO members individually and collectively are going to have to really stump up, both in terms of cash, but just general support, and that's going to be really challenging. And I worry that we're almost at the mercy of US electoral politics. It's not like our own system in the UK that from the election on the 5th of November, there's a transition period until the 20th of January 2026. And my worry is that actually that period is going to be where everyone does their thinking and say, well, what do we do now? Whereas actually, a second Trump presidency is a risk, and you mitigate risks. And I think there's a lot happening in terms of discussions about how sort of real they are at the moment. I'm not getting many signals that it's sort of moving forward in terms of what the Europeans will be able to do with a more disengaged US.
You said earlier when we were talking about Ukraine's membership of the alliance that the irreversible path is reversible. Do you think that Ukraine will join NATO one day?
When you look at all of the documentation, it says yes, but there's progress over the last 16 years has been very difficult, and I actually think it's worth looking at the example in Georgia at the moment. We thought that Georgia was on an irreversible path towards Euro-Atlantic integration, now due to the new foreign interference in the Russian law. Actually, what was striking about the declaration yesterday, there's no mention of Georgia. So even last year, it was Ukraine and Georgia. Now, no mention of Georgia whatsoever. And the war has already changed Ukrainian society. They are far more European leaning, but that isn't a guarantee for potential future, the way that political administrations could go. It's not a foregone conclusion. And with this irreversible language, I just think that NATO has slightly backed itself into a corner, because with the semantic gymnastics of saying, will be a member, future in NATO, irreversible, the next summit next year is in The Hague. Where do they go? They either have to provide lots of tangible things to Ukraine that really matter, or they have to give an invitation. If they don't, then that's going to start to potentially split the alliance. And the real risk is the reporting, which again, hasn't fully been verified, but this idea that, in future negotiations with Russia, Ukrainian membership of NATO might be put on the table, i.e. saying a commitment that Ukraine will never join NATO for us to get concessions on the Russian side. And if that happens, I think that would be a pretty catastrophic split that might be insurmountable within the alliance. So I think, going back to my earlier point on the invitation and this push for unity and short-term unity, is actually the consequences you're risking long-term unity within the alliance.
Insurmountable split within the alliance, consequences what?
Well, if, for example, a future US administration wants to put Ukrainian membership on the negotiating table between Ukraine and Russia, there are very strong advocates in the alliance, particularly in the Baltic countries and others, including the UK, that would really not be able to sign up to that. And that, that really risks the unity and the sort of the splits that you'll see in the alliance. It's important, we always talk about NATO being the most successful long military alliance in history. Yes, it's a military alliance, but also it's a political alliance. It runs on consensus. And, if that consensus frays too much, it's going to be very, very difficult from appointed decision making in the future.
So, Ed, 75th anniversary of NATO, you're heading home now. What's it given you to think about?
Well, I think the main issue is, looked forward to the next summit. The problem with the sort of summitry and pageantry of all of these things now is that you have to have large commitments and announcements of the summit. So nothing significant from a NATO perspective is going to come through for another 12 months. And obviously there's going to be a lot of political change within that next 12 months. So I think looking forward, this does sense there's a bit of a pre-storm summit sort of feeling about this one, that there's a lot of political change to come. The military balance on the ground within Ukraine could change pretty dramatically in the next year as well, in potentially both ways. But I think the views for next year, there's going to be a lot of really hard decisions that NATO will have to tackle, which pretty much they've been deferring for a number of years now, not just on Ukraine, but I think as in terms of the future of the alliance. The alliance relies on strong US leadership. If you start to pull that away, if you start to sort of take the dried glue out of all of the other areas, it's what then does NATO look like as an organisation? And I think as an organisation, NATO will fundamentally transform. It will have to change the way that it operates in that environment.
Ed Arnold, much to talk about for another time. Really good to speak to you. Thank you for making the time.
Thank you.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio. My thanks to Louis Sykes, our producer. To support the work of Frontline, hit the subscribe button. You can also listen to Times Radio throughout the day or read it at times.co.uk. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.